It was traumatic, humiliating, horrific. That's what members of Delaware State University women's lacrosse team are saying after their bus was pulled over in Georgia for a minor traffic stop and they were searched for drugs. The historically black college, quote, is incensed, but what they say is clear racial profiling from Georgia deputies. The head coach saying 6 white deputies and a police dog searched the vehicle with no probable cause. And the deputy, quote, quickly went to marijuana, which stereotypically is unfortunately associated with African Americans. That's the first thing that he went to. Deputies checked the students' bags for 20 minutes. They found nothing. What is the reason to check these students for drugs over a minor traffic stop on a bus? Here is video taken from inside the bus.
Why I'm coming on the bus right now is to tell y'all, look, we're gonna check y'all's luggage. Okay? If there is anything in y'all's luggage, we're probably gonna find it. Okay? I'm not looking for a little bit of marijuana, but I'm pretty sure you guys as chaperones are probably gonna be disappointed in you if we find it. You guys are on a lacrosse team, correct?
Yes.
So if there is something in there that is questionable, please tell me now. Because if we find it, guess what? We're not going to be able to help you. Okay? You are in the state of Georgia. Marijuana is still illegal in the state of Georgia. Okay? Anything that you can put marijuana in, maybe a device where you smoke it, maybe something that you would weigh it, like a set of scales, anything. Okay? If there's nothing, then I'm thankful to make my job a lot easier. We're going to get this done, and we'll have you guys on your way. Okay? You guys have any more questions for me? Have I explained it pretty good?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's absolutely disgusting. It's straight up intimidation and harassment by the police. There's no probable cause to go looking for drugs with a bus full of college kids. And they didn't find any drugs. The Georgia sheriff says that the incident is under review, but denied any racial profiling.
Although I do not believe any racial profiling took place based on the information I currently have, I welcome feedback from our community on ways that our law enforcement practices can be improved.
Herschel Walker approves of that explanation. We are still waiting for those law enforcement practices to be improved all over the country. Nearly 2 years since George Floyd was murdered on tape, 2 years since Black Lives Matter protests flooded the streets across the world in a pre-pandemic, pre-vaccine world, demanding police reform. Republican politicians at the time were saying this.
We need to be a country where communities of color feel confident that the police are there to safeguard their rights.
There's going to be a genuine effort to bring reform to a problem that's been going on well before President Obama.
We can train our officers better. We can find ways and mechanisms to de-escalate the situation.
Real talk. What have they done since? What have any of them done since? The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was blocked in the Senate and negotiations collapsed last fall, in large part due to Tim Scott. You see this headline and the date from last year? Nothing has happened. President Biden ran on the promise of reform, but in his State of the Union, he told America that he wants to fund the police.
Now is the time for racial justice. I believe with every fiber in my being, we have such an opportunity now to change people's lives for the better.
But we haven't seen real police reform. There needs to be a stronger push to action. The Delaware Attorney General now calling for a federal investigation into this case in Georgia. The university's president vowing a full probe as well. But federally, nationally, more needs to be done. Joining me now is Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, an activist and host of the Undistracted podcast. I can't think of a better person to talk to about this. Brittany, I'm infuriated as an American, as a black person, and as a college professor who teaches at an HBCU. What was your reaction when you saw this video and you saw the story? Just what's your first sort of visceral reaction when you see this kind of police intimidation and harassment?
I'm infuriated as well, Jason. We have to recognize the messages that come from moments like this, that to Black young people, no matter what you're doing or how correct you come, if you are seeking higher education, you are learning teamwork and discipline through a sport or an extracurricular activity, that no matter how perfect you are in your Black body, you still can and will be criminalized. And as a society, we should get the message that there is no amount of compliance or respectability that a Black person can inhabit that will spare us from this kind of harassment. I also found myself worried because I know that the average person who does not understand these situations might look at that and say, well, the police officer was plenty polite, so there's nothing really to be worried about here. Instead of asking the systemic questions of why this bus was stopped in the first place, why these players in particular, why were those drugs the ones that were being searched for, why was this search happening when, as you said, there was no probable cause, and why does this go on all the time? Because there are plenty of times that this is happening and there is no video evidence to prove it.
And one of the key things when you talk about that they didn't find anything, one of the young women reported, and this was reported in a local newspaper back up in Delaware, that one of the officers brought in a package and says, whose is this? She says, it's mine. He's like, what is it? And she's like, it was a gift that my aunt gave me to not open until graduation. The police officer opened it and then challenged her and said, why would you take a gift that you didn't know what was in it? Because it was a graduation gift. You know, Brittany, part of what also gets me about this is the Democratic Party, the Republican Party have failed consistently to do anything about police reform. This month is going to be 2 years since George Floyd was killed. And we're not seeing any progress on police reform. And I've said very clearly, consistently, that I think we should abolish policing as we know it and start from scratch. But from your perspective, what do you think the Democrats, who are the only party that kind of talks about police reform, what should they be doing right now about these kinds of issues, about this kind of systemic harassment? Because it doesn't look like they've done anything in the last 2 years, and people are going to be frustrated when it comes time to go to the polls this fall.
You know, Jason, you bring up the timeline, and it really matters here. We're almost 2 years removed from the murder of George Floyd. We're almost 8 years removed from the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. We are 30 years removed from the beating of Rodney King, which is where a lot of us saw that happening on tape for the very first time. We are 30 years removed from that LA uprising. So we've had the videotapes for a long time. We've had the police violence for as long as Black people have been in America. And in 2015, when I sat on President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, back then we were talking about issues of body cameras. Back then we were talking about issues of training and how police are held accountable. Guess what? Communities came along several years ago and said, we're willing to give politicians and political leaders the opportunity to try these things. They've been tried and they're not working. So frankly, when Republicans and Democrats come and say, well, we're finally ready to try those reforms, it's far too little too late. Communities are saying very, very clearly that a fundamental transformation of the system of public safety has to happen and nothing less. So Democrats would be wise not only to take this on at a federal level, but at a local and state level. They need to be the ones redirecting bloated police budgets back into housing and clean air and clean water, education and livable wages in their communities. They need to be the ones in the governor's houses and in state legislatures making sure that laws that continue to protect police from accountability are no longer passed. We need to see this action happen from Democrats at every single level. That's not only how you're going to excite voters, that's also how you're going to protect your constituents.
People weren't marching in 2020 over voting rights. They weren't marching over abortion. They were marching because of George Floyd, police brutality, and it's time for somebody in Washington and state levels to step up. Brittany Packnett Cunningham, thank you so much for joining me this evening.